Welcome to another episode of Drunken Medicine, where we are drunk on medicine and passionate about whiskey. My name is Michael Johnson. You've seen me for a few episodes now, but I'm an acupuncturist, been practicing for a long time, and have treated all kinds of conditions. And with me, as usual, is Dr. Ash May. He's amazing. Say hi, Ash.
Hey guys, so I'm Dr. May. I'm a naturopathic physician, board certified in endocrinology. I've been practicing for about 13 years, with the last 5+ years mostly specializing in endocrine disorders, like what we're talking about today with diabetes.
I know this is actually going to be a really exciting one because this is an epidemic in
Oh,
the
for
Western
sure.
world. It's an
Yeah,
epidemic. So this is
absolutely.
everyone, I think, probably either has diabetes or knows someone with it at this point. I would say almost everyone in the
Yeah,
country.
absolutely. Or
Yeah.
has prediabetes or metabolic syndrome or some kind of variation thereof. Yeah.
Well, speaking of diabetes, I'm going to show you what I'm drinking today.
Yeah, right.
Now, this is actually a really nice
Great
51.
segue there, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. It's a nice 51% straight bourbon out of Jonesboro, Tennessee. It was a gift from my cousin. Yeah,
Jonesboro. I've never
yeah.
even
So
heard of
Tennessee
Jonesboro.
Hills Distillery. It's S.E. Callahan's. It's pretty darn
Okay.
good. I like it a lot.
Is
So
it?
standard straight
So,
bourbon. It's good.
okay. Okay. So, what kind of notes are you getting there? Can give us a little bit more.
Alcohol. No, I'm kidding. No, it's very
Yes.
it's when you have like the spicy oak bourbons,
Yeah.
they're just
Yeah.
very much like that new oak punch with the spice.
Yeah.
That's what this one is.
Yeah.
It's not the sweeter bourbon. It's much more of the
Mhm.
spicy oak,
Okay.
lots of tannins. It's really, really it's a rich bourbon. It's really
Yeah.
nice.
Gotcha. Yeah. As you can see, we are passionate about whiskey, but we are not whiskey connoisseurs. So, like, that's good.
That's good. Well, it actually, I will not talk about The Office, but I will talk about The Office. When Michael's trying, it reminds me when Michael's trying to like describe what the drinks are like, and he's like, it has kind of an oaky afterbirth. I'm like, yeah, that's not the word you're going for. Let's pick something else.
Not after birth. No, no, nobody wants to describe their whiskey as after birth.
So it looks like you're drinking tea today, huh?
I am. So I've been fighting off a cold the last few days. So thought it would be, responsible not to have some
Wow.
whiskey today. Although I might have a little toddy later on at bedtime. But yeah, I'm having some ginger green tea, which is kind of my go-to tea for the day.
And see, I come from the country, from the hills of Tennessee, and there, Grandma would give you some whiskey when you were sick. So
Oh yeah, yeah. That's the only time we'd ever get it.
yeah, exactly. But I
I
completely
think we had
understand.
a I think we had a bottle of Jack Daniels that probably lasted us most of my childhood.
Mhm.
You knew where it was. It was up in the upward, level cupboards, and would only come down if one of us was sick. And
Yeah.
but it did help. It seemed.
Yeah, my grandma was anti-alcohol with the exception of when you were sick.
Yeah, yeah,
That was the
yeah,
exception.
yeah. No, I get it.
Well, good
All
job
right,
drinking
you
the
ready
tea,
to
though. Good
dive
job.
into diabetes?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's dive in.
Okay.
So
All right.
I want to hear you talk about from the Western perspective, what is diabetes? Because I think that it's really
Yeah,
misunderstood. People just don't know.
yeah, yeah. You're right. It's So first, let's kind of set the stage of why. Like, why is this such a huge issue? And it's because it's so prevalent. Like you were just talking, it's an endemic. It's become this ridiculous thing that we have to deal with now. Let's see, it's like 30. Let me make sure I get these right. 37 million Americans have diabetes. That's
Wow,
11% of the population, 18 and over.
crazy.
96 million have prediabetes, which is almost 40% of the adult population. And then 26.5 million of people over the age of 65 have prediabetes or diabetes. That's 50% of that population.
Wow.
So it's really ridiculous. And it cost us about $327 billion per year to treat.
Ooh.
Yeah. So we want to balance the budget here. Let's do a better job of preventing and treating diabetes.
That's a lot of roads. I
Um,
just want to say that's a lot
yeah,
of.
yeah. Talk about a nice infrastructure bill.
It's true. It's
That would
true.
go a long way. So, it's like we'll get into kind of what diabetes is, but when you have diabetes, it increases risk for everything else. So we sometimes refer to it as sort of the gateway, condition, because it's going to open the floodgates up for so much more. You've
Yeah.
got cardiovascular disease, so heart attacks, strokes, things like that, chronic kidney disease, dementia, most forms of cancer, and then you've got all the other complications of diabetes, neuropathy, losing limbs. Like I know several family members who have actually lost toes and limbs, and had to have their leg amputated from the knee down. So it can have some pretty profound effects.
Yeah,
So
and yeah, that's crazy. You mind if I share a personal story real quick?
yeah, go ahead.
Kind of my why that diabetes is important to me is so that's where all my mom's health problems started. She was only 42, 43. She was my age when she got diagnosed. And like you said, she didn't think it was a big deal. It's just diabetes. She kept eating what she was eating. She kept drinking what she was drinking. And it ended up leading to all these hosts of health problems that ended up like ruining a lot of her life as far as being able to do the things she wanted to do. Because all of a sudden she got high blood pressure, and then she got kidney damage, and then she had a stroke, and she had more kidney damage, and she had dialysis. But that diabetes was the start. That was the beginning point.
Yep.
So,
Yep, absolutely. Like I said, it's a gateway condition. It's going to open the floodgates up for so many other issues and complications. And it's sad because it's preventable. It's completely lifestyle related for the most part. Now there are some like toxin exposures and some other things that can lead you at a higher risk of developing it. But for the most part, the vast majority of cases are going to be preventable from lifestyle modifications, right?
absolutely.
Eating right, exercising, sleeping well, managing your stress. Those are all factors that can help decrease your risk for developing diabetes.
Absolutely. And I think that really shows just how important this subject is. So, keep tuning in. We're going to give you guys some tips and some ideas of what to do.
Yeah. So let's talk about what diabetes actually is. So the technical definition of diabetes is having a hemoglobin A1C above 6.5. Now, that may not mean a lot to people, but basically what that's doing is it's giving us an average of what your blood sugar looks like. Okay. And over a 3-month period, roundabout, that's the average of a process called glycation. So a hemoglobin A1C is the measure of this process of glycation, which is just where you add a sugar to a protein that happens inside a red blood cell. Now, a red blood cell lives about 90 to 120 days on average. And so what we can do is we can see what sort of the average amount of that sugar is over the course of that red blood cell's life. And that's where we get the hemoglobin A1C, which is nice because otherwise we'd have to go through glucose monitors, and glucose can go up and down based on a number of factors like stress and diet and, sleep and all that sort of stuff too. So having an A1C is a really good marker. So I run, whether or not I think someone has diabetes or not, I'm going to run an A1C on everybody because I want to get a good idea of what's going on with them and if this is a really big risk factor. Now, there's a section for your A1C that's considered prediabetes, and that's from 5.7 to 6.4. So there is a range there where we know, like, all right, some things are starting to happen here, and we're starting to see signs of insulin resistance. And I'll talk more about that here in a second. And then that's a great time to really start buckling down because that's the period of time where we can see reversal of this much more easily through lifestyle modifications. Once you get above that 6.5 level, it gets a lot harder to change that with lifestyle modifications. Doesn't mean you can't do that. It just gets really, really hard. So oftentimes at that point, you're going to need medications to try to blunt that effect and get you moving in the right direction. And so the higher it is, the higher level of intervention that you're going to need. Okay. So the idea, of course, is to first know what your number is, and two, like do something proactive about dropping that number.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk more about the proactive things later in the episode. But I mean, you helped me. I didn't even know I had, like, I was close to prediabetes. And I remember you tested me years ago and I was at 5.6. And I didn't even know what that meant. You're like, you're on the road, dude. You're almost there.
Yeah.
And we got it
Yeah.
down to 4.9 with lifestyle changes, from 5.6 to 4.9 in 6 months, just from lifestyle changes.
Yeah. 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 And, you know, for myself, so I've been measuring this for years and years since, you know, I found out about it in med school. And I really struggled with this because I'm really active. I exercise a lot. I typically have a pretty good diet, besides my occasional whiskey. But you know, my A1Cs always ran about 5.5 to 5.7, which just baffled me. But you know, I realized like my family history is pretty strong, and so there are some genetic predispositions there that you could have to increase your risk for this. So we can dive into this a little bit more later on. But what I did was intermittent fasting. I did that for 3 years, and within the first like 6 months of doing that, my A1C dropped from 5.7 to 4.9. So
Wow.
it was the thing that actually like really turned the tide for my risk there. And if I continue to do that, I can keep my A1C, you know, right about 4.8 to 5.2 ish, somewhere in there. And that's kind of where I think that sweet spot is for most people.
Now,
But
you'd
anyway,
mentioned insulin. Doesn't the body have natural mechanisms? Because I mean, you know, I'm sure diabetes has been around a long time, and I'll talk about it later. But aren't there natural mechanisms to make sure that this doesn't happen, that it doesn't get to that point?
yeah. So the way it kind of works is, you know, you eat some sugar or some carbohydrates, you know, that, you know, break down into glucose. And so your levels of glucose in your bloodstream go up. Now, most of the cells in your body need insulin in order to take that glucose and shuttle it into your cells so that it can be used for energy inside the cells. So as your glucose goes up, typically your insulin goes up too. Now the problem with that is your cells are really smart, and they've got these, you know, insulin receptors on the outside of the cells. If it notices like there's just too much glucose coming in, it's going to take those receptors and pull them back in, because it's like, hey, we take in too much glucose, we're going to kill ourselves. So we're not going
Mhm.
to do that. So we're going to pull our insulin receptors in. Well, when you do that, now the insulin can't dock onto that receptor, and glucose can't get into the cell. So what we end up seeing is your insulin levels and your glucose levels go up even more. We call that insulin resistance because your cells are resistant to insulin. That's what type 2 diabetes is.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people probably don't even know it because they're in the beginning, there's not a lot of symptoms probably. So people wouldn't even know this is happening until it gets to a bad point,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I mean, it's like high blood pressure. It's kind of a silent killer, right? It's by the time you become symptomatic, it's already progressed pretty significantly, which is why preventatively you want to get your numbers and know what your numbers are so that you can be proactive about your strategy to overcome or decrease your risk for it.
Yep. So for all my anti-healthcare of any kind friends, you should listen carefully to this part because, including myself, by
Yeah.
the way. I mean, Ash, you laugh at this.
Yeah.
I'm an acupuncturist who hates blood draws, and so you'll be
Yeah.
like, "Dude, you need to get your blood work," and I'm like, "I'm fine, I'm fine." He's like, "You're over 40. You need to get it checked."
So, and I totally get it, like this sort of distrust with the medical field and profession and all that. All right, I get some of that. But nowadays, you don't have any excuse. You can actually order these labs online for the most part and do them yourself. So it's like, well, you know, if you really want to take responsibility for this, there are ways to sort of navigate around that. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing that for everything because obviously, like you need some training in order to be able to interpret these labs and things like
Yeah,
that. So you still need to find some type of medical professional to help kind of guide you through that process. But
absolutely.
like I said, a lot of this stuff you can do on your own. And I have a lot of patients that do that. They'll run their own labs. They'll send them to me once a year and just say, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And then we'll just kind of go from there. So
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that it's really easy to avoid this stuff, but I always let people know, would you rather get a brief test, like a short blood test just to see where you're at, Or would you rather have insulin shots for the rest of your life with all these major risks and testing your blood glucose with a stab in the finger 4 times a day? Like, which one of these sounds better in the long run?
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I know, right? A little today, prevents you from a lot of stuff later on. So you have to
yeah,
pick your poison there. Yeah.
no,
And,
absolutely.
it gets harder and harder for us to navigate, away from sort of diabetes and the risk, just because everything in our society is convenient, and convenient food and things like that are obviously going to be, those foods are going to be high in salt and sugar and fats, all the things that make us unhealthy. But you're going to get a massive amount of that in any sort of fast food that you're taking in.
And
So
yeah, and that's
go
one
ahead.
reason why in Chinese medicine, when you look at diabetes, it's Xiaoke. But they only looked at thousands of years ago. They only looked at the very end phase. So basically, it just means thirst and urination. That's like the translation. It's like you pee, you get really thirsty and you pee a lot. So it's looking at the very, very
Mm-hmm.
end of the
Yeah.
line because it's silent.
Yeah.
So it's like it's really hard. And there are treatments
Yeah.
for earlier on, but what you would call diabetes as far as a translation was actually the very, very end of the line of people who were just in really bad shape.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. So what would they do for that end stage, so diabetes, once they figured it out? What was
Man,
it called again?
Xiaoke,
Shaka. Okay. All
Xiaoke.
right.
You,
Shaka.
you
Okay.
put him down at that point. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding, folks. I'm joking. No,
All right. Put them out to pasture.
there's some good Chinese herbal formulas that it's interesting because these formulas are for what they would call like really severe yin deficiency, which we've talked about before, kidney yin deficiency. But they've found that these specific formulas and herbs for yin deficiency also are really good at regulating blood pressure and glucose levels. So
Hmm.
Tian Chi is a good example, and we'll go into this during the treatment phase. But they had a lot of Chinese herbs and lifestyle stuff that they would do to be able to help people because they didn't have what we have now. I mean, there's even a formula that is comparable to metformin, not exactly, but comparable to metformin as far as helping with when somebody actually has diabetes. If you can't get metformin, it's a good comparable helping herbal formula. So.
Huh. Interesting. Okay. Cool. I'm excited to kind of go through that. Okay. So as far as what diabetes is and all that, so mostly what we're talking about today is insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. Now, there are other types of diabetes. Type 1 is the autoimmune condition. We used to call this juvenile diabetes. Now we just call it early onset diabetes or it's insulin dependent diabetes, because we're seeing a surge in adults getting this now. And I think that
Really?
has to go back to just the increase in autoimmune conditions that we're seeing now. And so the prevalence of all of these autoimmune conditions, whether it's type 1 diabetes or Hashimoto's thyroiditis or MS or all of that, the incidence is really starting to head upwards. And we're still trying to figure out, like, why that is. Is it,
Yeah.
all the toxins and junk that we're exposed to every day that's affecting our immune system, or, what is it? I'm not sure. But we are seeing this pattern start to pop up with type 1 diabetes.
That's really odd. I didn't actually know that because you're right. Even when I was a kid, this is, the diabetes of, you just genetically, you're just
Yeah.
going to get it. It's just going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the analogy I use for autoimmune conditions is, your genetics load the gun, but your environment pulls the trigger. So it's like you can have that genetic predisposition, but you still need some type of environmental trigger. And so I think now we just have so many more environmental triggers that are creating this increased risk of these autoimmune conditions. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's kind of my theory anyway.
So you mind if we jump into triggers for a sec?
Triggers, yeah.
Yeah. So how about stress? Is stress a component at all with diabetes? Because you're talking about our culture and what goes on
Yeah.
in our society.
Yeah, good point. So yeah, stress. So one of our main stress hormones is cortisol, right? Cortisol, normally it wakes us up in the morning, gets us going, and gives us energy through the day. But it's also one of our main stress hormones. It's in a class of hormones called glucocorticoids. So the way this works is cortisol goes up it tells your liver to dump a bunch of stored sugar called glycogen into your bloodstream to raise your blood sugar levels. That's one of the ways it gets you going first thing in the morning. And some diabetics, this is what we call the dawning effect too. It's like you wake up in the morning, you test your blood sugar, it's sky high, even though you haven't eaten anything. It's likely due to that cortisol response that you had. And some people have really robust cortisol responses, and some others don't have that great of a cortisol response. But regardless, if you're being stressed throughout the day, cortisol or adrenaline, which is another adrenal hormone, both of those can cause a spike in your blood sugar levels. So stress has a big component. It's a big component of diabetes.
Interesting. And, that makes sense also because in Chinese medicine, there's a whole bunch of different diagnoses that get to that Shao Ke layer. Mm-hmm. And the first one is actually liver qi stagnation, which we've talked about. One of the main symptoms or one of the main issues with that is stress and irritability. So if you're under a lot of stress, you're not sleeping particularly well, that's the base level from a Chinese medicine perspective, but where all this starts.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's good point about sleep too, because if you're not sleeping well, that's a huge stress on your body. So sometimes that too, if I see someone's blood sugar really high first thing in the morning fasting, then I'm curious, do they have sleep apnea or they have some other kind of issue with their sleep that's causing their body to be stressed? Because to sleep, that's where you produce all of your restorative hormones like testosterone and growth hormone and all those things that help you repair from the damage the previous day. So if you're not sleeping well, you're kind of behind the eight ball because one, you're stressing your body out. So you got more stress hormones and now you're not able to repair like you're supposed to. So that just continues to increase sort of fatigue, exercise intolerance, all that kind of stuff that where you just don't feel like yourself, where you're able to do and push yourself like you want to push yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I wonder if that's some of the reason you're mentioning modern culture and the way diabetes has been going up. I wonder if that's part of the reason why, because in ancient cultures, people went to bed really early. And, they would wake up and there were no blue screens. There's nothing to interrupt your sleep, really. You went to bed with the sun and you woke up when it was time to farm, and that's what you did.
Yep. Yeah. Totally not the same now. Now we're on devices right up to bedtime. Most of these devices emit some type of blue light, which we know suppresses melatonin production. So if you're on a device late at night, then that could affect your ability to get into deep sleep, or at least delay that because of the effect it has on melatonin. So if you screw up your melatonin, production, you're going to screw up your cortisol production too, and vice versa. So, living in Alaska too, like we see a lot of circadian rhythm, conditions, just because we can't time our body clock to the sun, going up and going down. It's even more extreme there, right? Mm-hmm. But you can do some things to try to set that clock as best you can. But stress is one of the ways, easiest ways that you could throw that whole circadian rhythm just out of balance.
Interesting. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And then just being sedentary, it's not exercising enough, not moving enough. There was a study done a few years ago. It's probably been 12, 15 years now, where they followed people for a long time. And what they found was if you set for 6 or more hours per day in total, you got a 40% increased risk of dying from all-cause mortality. That's from anything over the next 15 years. The average person in the study was around 40. So it's like, all right. So, and that was despite your exercise regimen. So no matter how much exercise you did, if you set for 6 or more hours a day total, you had this increased risk of all-cause mortality. That was huge. Most of us think, oh, yeah, I've got a desk job. Yeah, I got a desk job. I'll just go exercise more. But that's not necessarily the issue, because if we look at, the calories in versus calories out equation, the calories out part of the equation is your basal metabolic rate plus the thermic effect of activity plus the thermic effect of food. Well, the thermic effect of activity includes how active are you through the day, and then how much exercise are you getting. About 80% of that number is how active are you through the day.
Oh,
So it's
wow.
like you're going to burn more calories that way than by exercise typically. So that's where like this is a great place to start is just try to increase your overall activity first before you try to figure out strategies for increasing your exercise.
That makes a lot of sense. So do you start a lot of times with people with prediabetes where you can, basically give them some tips to prevent it from getting to the next phase? Is that where you kind of start?
Oh, absolutely. Do we want to jump into treatment?
Yeah, let's jump into
What do you
treatment.
think?
Let's go for it.
Yeah. Okay. Let's do it. All right. So yeah, I always start with foundational stuff. So I try to sort of navigate things around what I call the core four, and that's nutrition, movement, sleep, and stress management. So we'll kind of structure a plan based around those four pillars of health. So nutrition wise, okay, obviously we want to try to have a low glycemic sort of index type of diet. And what I mean by glycemic index is we've created numbers that are associated with how fast a food will spike your blood sugar. So things like white rice and white bread, things like that will spike your blood sugar really, really fast. Okay. You take something else like steel cut oats, which have a lot of carbohydrates, but they have a ton of fiber in them as well. Their glycemic index isn't near as high. Okay.
Mhm.
So first of all, we want to try to create a plan, a nutrition plan that reduces that glycemic index as much as possible. It's also called the glycemic load, which is just all of that food, the index of all that food put together. So we want your glycemic load through the day pretty low. Other strategies would be, never eat carbohydrates, no matter if they're complex carbohydrates, just by themselves. You want
Hmm.
to add some fat and some protein in with that too, because what that does is it slows down the breakdown and the absorption of that sugar. So we can prevent your blood sugar from creating these big spikes through the day, because with every big spike, you're going to get a very big trough too. And we don't want your blood sugar doing this throughout the day. We want it coming up and having small little increases as you eat, and then staying pretty steady through the rest of the day. That's ideally what we're shooting for there. So following that sort of glycemic index is a pretty good start for you nutrition wise. Exercise wise, kind of goes back to what we were talking about. Increase your overall activity. So know how many steps per day that you're getting on average. If you're getting 2 or 3 thousand steps a day, that's ridiculous. You really need to up your game there. That's a great first step to do it. Go for a 15 to 30 minute walk after your big meals. That's not much to try to put into your day, but we want to get that number up to about 8 to 10,000 steps a day. That's
Yeah.
where we really see really good glycemic control. But if you're averaging 3,000 steps a day, make a plan to increase that by 500 steps per day every week, so that eventually you're going to get up to that 8 to 10,000 steps every day. Okay.
That's awesome.
Um, yeah. Sleep wise, we kind of talked about it. You have to be sleeping well. So practice good sleep hygiene, which means that, about an hour before bedtime, just shut your devices down. Start doing stuff that's really like calming to your body. So a hot shower, meditation, prayer, stretching, read something really easy. Don't have like very difficult conversations with your spouse right before
Hmm.
bedtime, because that's just going to trigger that stress response too. And again, it's going to inhibit your melatonin production and affect your sleep. And if you're struggling with sleep and you've never had a sleep study done, maybe it's time to consider doing that to see if you have sleep apnea and you need a device or something like that to help you. And then the stress management part, this is the area I feel like most people are most deficient in, because we're not taught good stress management techniques.
Yeah.
We don't learn how to meditate. That's kind of like an Eastern culture type of thing, right? Um, we don't learn strategies to mitigate the response of stress on our
Yeah.
bodies. It's not like stress is going away, but we can teach our bodies how to mitigate the effects of that stress, so that we don't spike our cortisol and adrenaline up so much, right?
Yeah.
And so deep breathing, meditation, prayer, exercise, guided imagery, counseling, like, if people are just kind of at a loss, I'll send them to a counselor just so that they can talk about all the different types of tools that are out there for helping to mitigate that stress response.
That's actually a really good point. And, it's so funny that so many of these recommendations go right along with a lot of Eastern culture stuff, which you've already talked a little bit about. In East Asian medicine, one of the worst things you can do is ice cream is considered like pretty much evil by all my Chinese teachers. It was considered like the evil food because it's cold, it damages your digestion, it's fatty, and it's lots of sugar.
Yep.
It was just considered
that's true.
Worst, it's the worst food.
Yeah.
So you mentioned not eating a lot of sugar, and even worse is the low fat ice cream, because you mentioned not eating sugar by itself, and people are like, oh, but we'll just do low fat ice cream. It has 2 grams of fat and 60 grams of sugar. Let's do it.
I know, right? It's like, oh yeah, that whole wave of like fat-free or non-fat stuff that started happening in like the 70s and 80s and then trickled into the 90s. Like, oh, that was such a bad idea.
Well, the sugar companies were behind a lot of that. They've actually shown over the years that they had a huge pull of the lobbyists. And so y'all need to realize, if you're listening to the show, that there are corporations at play that want you to keep consuming. Keep consuming.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's their business model, right? That's how they sell products. So
anyways, that's a good point about the food, and also the steps is a really good point, because you were asking earlier, or we were asking, why now as opposed to 1,000 years ago. And I think that's part of it. Is 1,000 years ago you walked to your farm from your house, and then you farm and you walk all day, and then you walk back, and so you're constantly active. Like, you aren't weightlifting, but you're constantly moving at all times.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even 100 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, these kind of diseases like diabetes and gout and some of those were sort of the disease of the kings, right? The royalty, the people who could, had the luxury of sitting around all day and not really working, right? It's like, well, that's become kind of standard, or to, par for sort of standard American diet and how we function now.
Yeah. And the same thing for sleep. And you mentioned reading books. I do want to point out to the listeners, this is a paper book. And for you younger listeners, that's when there's pages from a tree. and you actually pull it open with your hands, just in case we don't know what that is now. I know I'm showing my age at 42 there, but I mean, I'm talking to myself too, because I do a lot on my device. I do a lot of audiobooks. I do a lot of visual, like books on my phone. So I have to remind myself, a paper book, with a dim light.
Yep. It's hard, man. I know this, and I still struggle with this because I'm just like a consumer of information. So it's like, you've got this device, this phone, that you've got access to all the information in the world, basically. It's like, I just feel like I got to spend every second like consuming. And that really plays a huge effect on your nervous system, your ability to just kind of chill out your mind at nighttime, so that you can actually get into deep sleep. Because again, if our minds are stressed, it's not time to sleep, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And one more thing you said that I think was dead on is you're talking about meditation. In Eastern medicine, you look at Qigong or Tai Chi. And I know people who lived in China who said they would go do Tai Chi in the park every single morning before going to work. It was a part of the lifestyle. You spend a half an hour doing Tai Chi.
Yeah. Well, you see some companies in Asia do that as part of like their corporate wellness. They have everybody out in the courtyard doing exercises before work, or like during the middle of the day at lunchtime. Like, that's just kind of standard part of their business structure.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine that Burger King? They're all outside the Burger King, and they're like,
that would be ironic for sure.
Have it your way.
but not until like 30 minutes. Let us meditate and exercise first.
It's true. But I think we could learn something from that. Like, I mean, if you own a company, or if you're a part of a company where you're a manager, these are things that you can implement to help the people around you, honestly, is implement time for people to calm themselves and do some light movement before going into the day.
Yeah. Well, it's just it. Like, if we're trying to survive, we're stressed out, we're trying to work really hard and just survive, just make ends meet. That's not the way that you thrive. Like surviving and thriving are completely dichotomous, right?
Yep.
It's not
Yep.
that you can do both at the same time very well. So if you're stressed highly, it's not a good formula for thriving and being
Mhm.
well and decreasing risk for all of these conditions, including diabetes. So what I often have patients do is I'll have them formulate what's called like a healthy day template, which is just like, hey, what would be your idea of like the perfect healthy day? What time would you wake up? What would you do first? What would you eat? When would you exercise? How would you stay active? When would you meditate or whatever stress management technique that you want to do? Like structure that out, throughout the day. Not that you have to hit that every day because nobody's going to do that, but you need a good template or a plan that you're striving for. If you don't, you're just kind of left to just figure this out day by day. And most of the time, those strategies don't happen. I mean, if you're planning to run a marathon in a month, you're not going to just not train or train when you feel like you can get it in and then go out and run your marathon, right? You're going to go through a lot of pain if you do that. So you've got to methodically set out a plan to get you where you want to go. Same way with this, especially
Yeah.
when it comes to stress management, because we're not very good at that in
Yep.
this
I
society.
agree. And honestly, if you're feeling overwhelmed hearing this, as far as prevention goes, like talk to somebody, talk to Ash, talk to myself. We're open books, like anyone, and start with one step. If there's like one thing you can do tomorrow, like right now, not like in the future, but right now to
Yeah.
prevent, then do it now. If it's eating ice cream at 11 o'clock at night, that's your thing, is that you get
No.
stressed and you eat ice cream at 11 o'clock at night before bed. Stop that one thing, just that one thing, and
Right.
then see how you
Yeah.
feel.
Yeah. I remember when I was in med school, I was in some clinical rotations and we had this guy come in and well, he was a mess. Like he had diabetes, just like we were talking about today. He had high blood pressure. He had a ton of other stuff too. He was on just a ton of, I think it was like 7 or 8 different medications. Just felt miserable, tired. I mean, there's a ton of stuff that we needed to kind of work on, right? And I remember stepping out, talking to my supervisor, and going, "Man, I'm overwhelmed. Like, where do I start with this guy? Like, he's a mess, you know."
Mhm.
And he's like, "Just start small and go incrementally." So he actually walked in with me, and we kind of walked through this together. But basically, we started out with, "Hey, you don't drink any water. Your body's made up of 80+% water, so it's like let's start there. So I want you to drink this amount of water every day for the next week, and then you're going to come back and we're going to talk about the next thing to do." So for the next 8 weeks this guy came back and we added one more little thing, or we took one little thing out, like the ice cream, right? At the end of 8 weeks he was off half of those medications at that point
Oh,
and
that's awesome.
felt tremendously better. But again, it's like, how do you eat an elephant, right? It's like
Yeah.
one bite at a time. Like you have to create a plan first and then
Mhm.
try to implement very small steps to get you where you want to go.
Yeah. And I'm glad you went
Yeah,
into that
go
because I
ahead.
think that goes into the next subject. So we talked about kind of what you do as far as prevention if somebody's in pre-diabetes. How about if somebody comes in and you look at their A1C and it's 8.5 and they're like clearly diabetic, they didn't know they were diabetic. What do you do then?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, we still have to talk about foundational stuff because that goes without saying. Like, if we throw a bunch of medications on there, they're going to be minimally effective if you're still going to eat, Big Macs and, fries and tons of like a large soft drink, 3 times a day. So we still have to start with the foundational stuff. But at that point, they're going to need some heavy herbs, some heavy medications. Metformin's a great one to start off for most people, just because it can improve the insulin resistance. So, and it's pretty safe. It's actually being researched right now for longevity medicine. So, as a way to sort of increase longevity and improve like sort of quality of life of people who don't have diabetes. So, and
Mhm.
we have a ton of research on it. So it's pretty safe for most people. Some people, have some side effects like loose stool and stuff like that, but most people tend to tolerate it pretty well, especially if they start at a low dose and work their way up. So that's
Yeah.
a pretty safe one. There are tons of other medications out there. I'm not going to go too much into depth with those because a lot of those are dependent, like the GLP ones and stuff like that, that
Yeah.
are becoming more and more popular. The PSKs too, or PSKs as well. And so there's tons of medications out there. But at that point, yeah, you're probably going to need some meds at least for a period of time until we can get that down into those mid sixes or below, and then you start taking stuff out, right?
Yeah.
Because you have the foundation of diet and exercise and sleep and stress. And if you can do that, oftentimes you can decrease that to the point where you can get off those medications. But it takes a ton of work. I'm not going to lie to you. It's hard. It's a lot of work. And I tell people all the time, every day, that, hey, what are you willing to do? Because whatever you're not willing to do, we're going to have to offset that with a medication likely in order to keep your risk of this progressing to get worse down. Okay. And that's what it's all about. We're trying to keep that risk down as much as possible. If you can't do that with lifestyle medications or modifications, we have to add medications in there to do that, to offset that. So it's like, it's your choice.
Yeah.
What do you want to do? Yeah.
No, it's absolutely true. And for me, I like my toes. Like, I'm kind of attached to my toes, and I think they're pretty great. So I am willing to do what it takes to keep my toes and not stroke out. I mean, really, because I've seen, with my mom, I've seen the other end of that. And so I think, prevention's great. But if you're at the point where you already have diabetes, we're not saying there's not help. Like Ash just said, there's still things you can do to make a difference.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You just got to create a plan. That's one of the biggest issues.
Yep. I mean, I know somebody who had a ridiculous A1C. By the time they found out they even had diabetes, they had to have insulin shots. They were basically had no insulin production whatsoever. That was the moment they found out. But you know what they did? They made a decision to change their lifestyle, and they went all out, and they're healthier than they've ever been. Yes, they still have to get insulin, but as far as their health goes, they're in great shape because they just decided to completely change their lifestyle. They don't eat carbs. They exercise. And so they've really turned around even where they're at in such an amazing way.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. But it's like the higher that number, the more work you're going to have to put in.
Yep.
And so it's like, well, put in a little work now to try to decrease your risk of developing that, or you're going to put a ton of work in later on. And hopefully that's enough at that point. Because sometimes by the time people are symptomatic and their levels are crazy high, you're already starting to get damage to the small blood vessels and the small nerves, like in your eye and in your feet and in your kidneys. So you're starting to see damage in those areas at that point that oftentimes is not reversible. So again, if you wait too long, there are going to be some consequences that you're not going to be able to reverse. So prevention is the name of the game. Like you got to figure out what strategy is going to work for you.
And it's a feedback loop. We can't talk about it in this episode because it would go on way too long. We're already going long. But, the kidneys and the heart and the blood pressure, it's a feedback loop. And so the more damage you do to one, the more damage you get to the other. And so we'll have a whole nother episode on all this. But just realize that when you're damaging one, it's going to feed on itself, and it's going to keep taking you down this road of disease.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, it makes sense like that from what we know of diabetes and what it does to the body. Yeah, it's damaging everything. So
we're going to have another episode on this because it's such a big subject.
Yeah, I know, man. I really want to go into more detail about the different types of diabetes and some more treatment strategies. Another natural one that I want to throw in there too is berberine. Berberine is kind of the natural sort of metformin. I use berberine for almost everybody with any glycemic issues, or if they have a high risk of cardiovascular disease. There was this really cool study that just came out that showed berberine lowers LDL, so your bad cholesterol, and it lowers something called TMAO, which is something that inhibits your nitric oxide production. Nitric oxide, remember, helps to dilate your blood vessels. So if you inhibit that, now you can have issues with blood pressure. right?
Mhm.
And so, plus that increases your risk for atherosclerosis, sort of hardening of the arteries. So, berberine was shown to decrease that risk. So, it's going to be a really good preventative for atherosclerosis and diabetes, which we already knew. It's been used for diabetes, prevention and treatment for a long time. But now we're starting to see the implications of some other, things as well, like heart
Yeah.
disease and stuff like that.
That's interesting. And, if somebody comes to me, I mentioned lifestyle stuff earlier. Acupuncture, I'm going to do, some Chinese herbs, Qigong, Tai Chi, that kind of stuff. And if they're in full on diabetes, I'm going to work with the doctor like yourself. But there's still things I can do. Acupuncture has been shown in studies to reduce blood sugar, reduce blood pressure, and help with stress responses, which is huge.
Yeah.
To help with sleep.
Yeah.
It's going to help with sleep.
Yeah. I remember a patient we had in Alaska that we shared together who had chronic kidney disease.
I know who you're
And
talking about.
we're
Yeah.
we're watching his GFRs and everything, and they're lowering and lowering and lowering. He started doing acupuncture, and they actually stopped decreasing and started going up a little bit more.
Yeah.
I was like, that blew me away because it just didn't make sense to my mind. Like, how does that even help? But it did. I could see the numbers change right in front of our eyes. So that's phenomenal. I'm curious too. It's with peripheral neuropathy that may be associated with diabetes. Is acupuncture good for that too?
Oh yeah, that's one of the biggest things I treat when somebody's already in diabetes. I mean, yes, I'm working on the kidneys and I'm working on the blood sugar, but peripheral neuropathy acupuncture is ridiculously successful. It's one of those conditions that's basically a home run. In your medicine, when there's conditions that it's a home run, pretty much no matter what. That's peripheral neuropathy for me. Like if they come in, they're going to notice a significant difference within 4 weeks, no matter what they're going to. I don't care where they're at in life. They're just going to notice a difference. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Makes no sense.
Oh,
it's
that's
crazy.
cool.
It works.
Yeah. Hey, and that's a game changer because, when you can't feel your feet, your toes, like, man, that affects everything every day. Your ability to walk, your risk of falling and fracturing something.
Or you lose a
that's
foot.
huge.
Or you lose a foot because you can't feel that you got stabbed. I mean, I know someone personally who stepped on a nail all the way through the foot and didn't know it because they had such bad neuropathy. So they walked around for a week with this nail in their foot, never realized it. And by the time they found it, it was emergency surgery. You may or may not save your foot.
Oh my gosh.
And it's like, because your nerves just are aren't working and you can't tell. So people don't realize it's not just discomfort. It's actually dangerous. Like you need to get help for this. It's a big deal.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. Okay. Treatment wise, anything else you want to throw out there?
Yeah. So acupuncture is terrific for all the symptoms. I also work on the kidneys, which in Chinese medicine, the kidneys are what you're going to work on for the blood sugar as well, believe it or not. I know everything's kidney. We talk about this every week, and Ash is like, yeah, kidney. Yep.
Yeah, that's going to be my guest for next week, no matter what we're
about. But actually, there's a good formula that's been used for a long time called Liu Wei Di Huang Wan. That's a lot of
Sorry, that
Liu Wei
you got
Di
to say
Huang
that
Wan.
a couple more times.
But it's really good for yin deficiency in the kidneys. But what they've shown in studies, for Western studies, is it reduces blood pressure and it reduces blood sugar, and very, very significantly. And so they're finding it's very beneficial. They've been using it for thousands of years for what we would say is yin deficiency. And then they're finding it actually has these positive effects for blood pressure and blood sugar.
Yeah. Isn't that funny? Like we're seeing that play out a lot now of using herbs and things that have been used traditionally for hundreds or thousands of years, now getting sort of validated because we can put them through an RCT, a randomized controlled trial and show like, oh yeah, it does do this, something that we've known about for hundreds or thousands of years. I mean, it's great that we're validating that, but still, it's kind of funny that we're kind of come full circle for a lot of those things now.
And I do want to give a disclaimer. If you want to use Liuwei Dihuangwan, I'm not saying go order it on Amazon. Talk to an herbalist, talk to an acupuncturist. See if it's right for you before you go order this product. I'm going to say that.
I don't think anybody could spell that, so I don't think you're going to have any issues.
Well, here's one.
I wouldn't even know how to Google that.
Here's one that somebody can spell. It's Tian Chi. It's actually Nodo ginseng. And it's been shown in studies to help significantly with blood sugar and blood pressure as well. And it's been used for thousands of years for diabetes, for what we, Shaka, basically the end stages. And so it's another one that's really beneficial, that if somebody's in a bad stage, working with their doctor, I would absolutely do it if they're getting regular blood work. And this is important. I'm gonna say this. I know you guys think I'm just covering myself. I'm not just doing that. I am, but I'm not. Because when you're taking medication, when you're taking all these different things, you add them in all at once, they can have synergistic effects, which means they can actually add to each other. So if you get somebody on metformin and you get them on multiple herbs that are lowering their blood sugar, you might have too much. And so you have to keep an eye on this.
Yeah. Oh, I'd made this mistake early on in my career. Someone came in with diabetes and I thought, man, I'm just going to load them up with everything. We're doing berberine and chromium and gymnema sylvestri and vanadium and just everything I could throw at them, and all the lifestyle stuff. And they were on metformin, some other medications, and ended up causing a hypoglycemic event. And they had to go to the emergency room for it. So it's like, yeah, you can get yourself into some trouble here. Make sure you have some guidance when you do this.
Yeah, definitely get guidance. But, I'm going to do herbs. I'm going to do acupuncture. I'm going to do Qigong, where people are actually doing some kind of Tai Chi or Qigong or meditation or prayer at home every single day. They're going to be looking at their sleep, good sleep habits. The same thing you do is the same thing I'm going to do. Is like, what are your sleep habits like? Oh, yeah, you're looking at TikTok until 1 a.m. That's probably a bad decision if you want to sleep. I'm not saying TikTok, anything. I'm saying anything, YouTube, whatever it is. Like,
yeah.
I'll keep it PG.
We're gonna get banned on TikTok now. So
I'm not insulting TikTok. I like TikTok. I have an issue myself. I have an issue with it. But those are the things I'm going to focus on, and then diet. And it's funny in TCM, the first stage, the thing they recommend is lots of fresh vegetables. A lot less sugars, a lot more fresh vegetables. So that's something I recommend for anyone coming in with this.
Yeah. And, most of this is stuff that people already get. It's not for lack of knowledge for the most part. Obviously, there's some nuances with treatment and stuff like that. But the basics, like most of us get, like that makes sense when we hear it, right? It's just the implementation of that, which is just so hard because we're being pulled from every direction every day. So we've got a ton of stress and we've got a ton of stuff on our plates. But that's why I love like creating that Healthy Day template, because it creates, at least some intention of trying to do some of those things that we know that are going to move the needle the right direction. Right. Yeah. But it's really about implementation, like figuring out the strategies to actually do the stuff that that you need to do to move that needle. So.
Yeah. And I love what you said about picking like one thing at a time and doing it incrementally. I think I do the same thing. It's like if you overwhelm somebody, or like if you're listening, like you shouldn't be overwhelmed. It's like you're going to pick one thing and then you're going to notice a significant difference. And then a week later, pick the next thing. And by the time you realize you've done something, it's going to be 6 months and you've done so much that everything's changed.
Yeah.
So,
no, I completely agree. Yep.
Yeah.
All right, man. Anything else?
No, I can't believe we went almost an hour, but man, this was a good topic. And we have to talk about diabetes again.
Yeah. For all of you who are still with us, thank you for sticking around.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And, thank you for supporting us. We're here for you. We look forward to helping you. And every week we're going to be talking about something that, either you or somebody probably is dealing with. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. And two, I just want to throw out, if you have questions about maybe something we talked about on an episode, or if you have something like some information you want us to talk about, send us an email at drunkenmedicine, Z-E-N at the end, at gmail.com. So it's drunkenmedicine@gmail.com. We'd love to just do whatever you guys want us to talk about.
And we'll put that in the description of the episode so that you guys can see it. But feel free to send any questions because we're doing this for you. We're here for you. So we're looking forward to helping you.
Yeah. And a good excuse to have a little whiskey.
That's true. Or tea, Ash.
Or tea. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I am trying to be responsible here.
I won't give you a hard time too much.
All right, guys. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll see you again next week.
Hey, thanks a lot. Good seeing you.